16. An entire world existed beneath Lut Gholein. No, corrected Kara, not a world, but something that seemed at least as large as, if not larger than, the regal kingdom far above her. The curious and unsettling figure she had identified as an impossibly old Horizon had led her down one confusing corridor to the next, and to the next, and so on until the necromancer had actually gotten dizzy trying to keep track of her path. She had climbed up and down stairs, walked through door after door, and past room after room until at last Horizon had brought her to this single chamber, this well-lit and well-furnished bedroom, and told her to sleep. Kara did not even remember lying down, but now she found herself atop the soft bed, staring up at the intricately sewn canopy there. She had imagined her quarters aboard the King's Shield to be the finest she would ever use, but these set even those to shame. Curiously, the elegant furnishings, while clearly of another time, another place, looked as if they had been made only yesterday. The great wooden bed appeared perfectly polished, the sheets crisp and clean, and the marble floor beneath spotless. The same went for the nightstand next to the bed and the chair in the far corner. On the walls had been hung richly woven tapestries of decidedly Vizeri tastes, fantastic creatures, and images of astonishing spellwork, all crafted by an expert artisan. If not for the fact that she was presently a prisoner in the lair of a possibly dangerous madman, the enchantress would have felt quite comfortable indeed. She dared not stay here. While legend had always spoken of Horizon as the brother, considered the lesser of two evils, he nonetheless not only remained an ambitious Vizeri, who had once, too, commanded demons to serve him, but who also clearly had lost his sanity over the centuries. Kara wondered how he had even survived for so long. The only records of such extensive life-extending spells had always included the summoning of unearthly powers to help cast them. If Horizon had turned again to demons for his needs, despite his constant mutterings to the contrary, then that would not only explain his present condition, but also gave Kara even more reason to find her way out before he returned. Still clothed, the anxious dark mage slipped out of the bed, heading immediately to the door. It did no good to try to see if Horizon had cast any spells upon it, for his entire sanctum emanated magic to such a staggering degree that she wondered why every spellcaster for hundreds of miles around could not have sensed its presence. Then again, perhaps that same magic explained why they did not. If even a portion of that might had been directed toward hiding Horizon's domain, then the greatest mages in all the world could have stood at its very doorstep and still not noticed the wonder at their feet. Deciding to take the risk, the necromancer tugged at the handle, only to find the door unmoving. She tried again, with equally dismal results. It hardly surprised her that she had been locked in, but the truth nevertheless frustrated Kara immensely. The necromancer had been trapped time and time again since beginning this chase, and now she wondered whether or not she would be able to escape this prison. Unwilling to give up, Kara touched the handle and muttered a spell of opening. It was a minor incantation, one that actually had its roots in Vizeri elemental sorcery, but the followers of Rathma had found it one of the few useful creations of the rival calling. That it almost certainly would fail did not escape her, but Kara could think of no other way out of the room that would not require a spell likely to bring the ceiling down on her as well. The handle turned. Startled by her unlikely success, the necromancer nearly flung open the door. Instead, taking a deep breath, Kara cautiously opened it a crack, then surveyed the outer hallway. Seeing no sign of danger, the dark mage quietly stepped out. She peered both directions, trying to recall by which she had earlier come. After a brief mental debate, Kara turned to the right and ran. The corridor ended at a stairway that led up, a hopeful sign. Kara pushed herself up the steps, certain that if she kept going the direction she did, the desperate spellcaster would eventually find her way out. The stairway stopped 2 flights later, opening up into a much wider corridor. Making certain that Horizon did not seem about, The necromancer crept down the larger hall. Although the room in which she had slept had been well decorated, the halls themselves seemed positively austere, with only the occasional door breaking the monotony. The one consistently odd element of her surroundings proved to be the yellow light, whose source never proved evident. It came from everywhere at the same time. There were no torches, nor anywhere even to put them. As she hurried along, Kara occasionally felt tempted to try one of the doors, but knew that it behooved her more to find the way out as soon as she could. Any lingering might give Horizon time to discover that she had gone missing. While the necromancer dearly wanted to know more about the mad mage and his sanctum, she desired to do so on her own terms, not his. Just ahead, the corridor took a hard right turn. Kara stepped up her pace, hoping that the change in direction meant that she had found a passage to the outside. The frustrated enchantress cut around the corner as quickly as she could, praying that somewhere at the end would be another stairway or, better yet, the true exit. Instead, she found herself facing a blank wall. The hallway simply ended, just a few yards after it had begun. Putting both hands to it, the necromancer checked the wall for illusions, magic, even a false front. Unfortunately, for all practical purposes, the barrier before her seemed as solid as it looked, even though she could find no good reason at all for its existence. Stepping back, Kara studied the only other direction. To return to the stairway made no sense, but that left to her only the doors. Surely they did not represent a path out of Horizon's domain. She went to the first, cautiously opening it. With her luck as it had been so far, Kara feared that her choice would turn out to be the ancient Viserai's very own chambers. Behind the door stood a long, curving passage. "Is that the trick, then?" she whispered to herself. Did the true way out depend on opening the doors and not following the regular corridors? Trust her demented host to design his underground lair in such an improbable manner? Eagerly, Kara Nightshadow hurried down the hidden corridor, not even bothering to shut the door behind her. Somewhere at the end, she would find escape. Somewhere she would find the way back to the old building or some other secret entrance into Lutko Lane. Instead, the necromancer found yet another door. She had no choice but to open it. There had been no other passage, no other entrance. However, at least this time Kara opened the door with some hope of success. She had journeyed for some distance. Horizon's maze-like sanctum had to come to an end, here and now. Another hallway greeted her. That it resembled the wide one Kara had long left behind did not bother her. Of course, the design would be similar. After all, the same man had created it all. Then she saw the open door, just a short distance to her left. With great trepidation, the weary necromancer walked over to it. She peeked inside, hoping her guess to be wrong. The same curved corridor Kara had just traversed greeted the weary woman. "Trag Ul, guide me out of the madness." What point had there been to a corridor that returned to the same hall? Kara blinked as another realization hit her. This door and the one she had returned by had been located on opposite sides of the hall. How could she possibly have looped around like that? The corridor would have had to cut through the hallway, a complete impossibility. Without hesitation, Kara headed for the lone door left to her. If it did not lead somewhere other than this hallway, then Horizon's bizarre realm had finally defeated her. To the necromancer's relief, though, the doorway opened into a vast chamber in which two sets of wide, banistered staircases flanked a pair of high bronze doors decorated with intricate dragon motifs. A well-preserved marble floor covered the entire expanse of the room, and more tapestries covered the stone walls. Kara stepped into the massive room, debating whether to choose the doors or one of the staircases. The doors looked most tantalizing, being directly across from her, but the stairs, too, enticed the necromancer, either one possibly leading to an exit above ground. A slight sound above her head made Kara look up, then gasp at what she saw. Far, far up, Horizon sat in a chair. the white-haired sorcerer mumbling to himself while he ate at a long dining table. The noise Kara had heard had been the madman laying his knife on what looked to be an elaborate gold plate filled with rich meat. Even though so far below, Kara could still smell its succulent flavor. As she watched, Horizon reached for a goblet of wine, the elderly Viserai taking a long sip without spilling so much as a drop. That feat especially amazed her, not because she had not thought the insane mage capable of simple table manners, but because he did so while he sat, upside down, on the ceiling. In fact, the entire tableau was upside down, and yet nothing fell toward Kara. The chair, the table, the plates full of fresh food, even Horizon's lengthy beard, all defied basic nature. Gazing around the ceiling in astonishment, the dark mage even saw doors and other staircases that would have suited the mage well in his present position. If not for Horizon and his elaborate meal, it would have been as if she stared at a mirror image above her. Still drinking, Horizon cocked his head up, or rather down, and at last caught sight of the startled young woman.
"Come, come," he called to her. "You're late. I don't like people late."
Fearful that he might use his considerable power to drag her up to the ceiling, perhaps forever eliminating her hopes for escape, Kara rushed across the great hall, heading to the bronze doors. They had to lead somewhere out of his reach. They had to. With one last look up at her captor, Kara flung open the nearest of the doors and darted through. If she could just keep ahead of him.
"Ah, good, good. Sit there, sit there."
Horizon watched her from the other end of a long, elegant table, identical to the one at which she had just seen him sitting. Only this time it stood not on the ceiling, but rather in the center of the room she had just now entered. The exact same meal, even down to the wine, lay spread before him. Beyond the mage, doorways and staircases, just like the necromancer had seen atop the other chamber, now served as backdrop to Horizon and his meal. Unable to prevent herself from doing so, Kara looked up at the ceiling. Staircases and doorways, all upside down, greeted her gaze. One of the latter, a bronze giant, stood open, as if someone had flung it aside in haste. "Rathma, protect me," Kara murmured.
"Sit, girl, sit,"
commanded Horizon, totally oblivious to her dismay.
"Time to eat, time to eat."
And with nothing more she could do to save herself, the necromancer obeyed. A storm covered the desert, a vast ocean of black, churning clouds that spread all the way from the east to as far west as Augustus Malevolent could see. Dawn had risen, but it might as well have been just after sunset, so dark had the day begun. Some might have taken such a threatening sky for a bad omen, but the general saw it instead as a sign that his time had come, that his day of destiny was at hand. Lut Gholein lay just ahead, and in it he knew cringed the fool who wore the glorious armor. His glorious armor. Zazax had assured him of the last. Where else would the stranger have gone? The winds blew strong, ensuring that no ship would be heading out to sea this day. He had to still be in the city. The general studied Lut Gholein from atop a massive dune. Behind him, and entirely invisible to the eyes of the enemy, Malevolent's demonic host patiently awaited his word. Because of the particular spell utilized, the sinister creatures still wore the shells of his men, although eventually they would be able to discard those. They had needed them to make the passage from hell to the mortal plane, and would yet require them for some time to come. That need, though, did not bother Malevolent. For the moment, it served better that the enemy thought this tiny army simply mortal. It would make the commanders in Lut Gholein overconfident, arrogant. They would commit themselves to tactics which would expend their might early for a quick victory, but in doing so they would merely be setting themselves up for a slaughter that Malevolent already much savored. Zazax joined the human, the mantis finally creeping into sight after being gone far too long. Something about that struck the general as curious. Of all the demons now with him, Zazax clearly had to be the most dominating, yet the insidious insect moved about as if fearful that, even on such a dark day, someone might see him.
"Why do you lurk about? What are you afraid of?" Malevolent asked, growing a bit suspicious. "Are you expecting something I should know about?" "This one is afraid of nothing," the mantis snapped, his mandibles working furiously. "Nothing."
However, in a slightly lower voice, he added,
"This one is merely cautious."
"You act as if you fear something."
"No, nothing."
General Malevolent again recalled both Zazax's reaction to the name Baal and the fact that Lut-Gholein had been said to house, underneath it, the Demon Lord's tomb. Could there then be some fact, after all, to that outlandish tale? Deciding he could investigate the demon's anxieties later, General Malevolent turned his gaze back to Lut-Gholein. The city lay unsuspecting. Even now, a contingent of the Sultan's forces rode out of the gate on early morning patrol, the riders' attitudes plain to see even from this distance. They did their rounds with the notion that no one would have the audacity to attack, especially by way of the desert. Lut-Gholein more feared attacks by sea, and on a day as fierce as this one looked to be, the odds of that appeared infinitesimal.
"We will let the patrol come as near as possible," he informed the mantis. "Then we shall take them. I want to see how your warriors act before we seek the city itself." "Not this one's warriors," corrected Zazax. "Yours."
The riders swept out, crisscrossing the land beyond the walls. Malevolent watched and waited, knowing that their course would soon enough take the patrol to where he wanted them to be.
"Prepare the archers."
A rank of figures stepped forward, inhuman eyes eager. Although they wore but the husks of Malevolent's men, the demons somehow retained the knowledge and skills of their victims. The faces Augustus Malevolent glanced at had been the faces of his best archers. Now the demons would prove whether or not they could do as well, or preferably, better.
"On my mark,"
he commanded. They readied their bows. Zazax spoke a single word, and the tips of the arrows blazed. The turbaned riders drew nearer. Malevolent shifted his mount, the better to be seen by them. One of the defenders noted him and called out to the others. The patrol, an estimated 40 and more in strength, turned toward the outsider.
"Be ready."
He urged his horse a few steps in the direction of the other riders, as if he intended to meet them. They, in turn, rode at a pace that suggested that they were wary, but not very much so. And at last, the soldiers from Lut-Gholein came near enough for General Malevolent's tastes.
"Now!"
Even the howling wind could not overwhelm the terrible shrieks of the feathered shafts in flight. A rain of death, undaunted by the gale, fell upon the enemy. The first of the arrows landed, some missing, some striking well. Malevolent saw a bolt hit one of the lead riders dead on, the shaft burning through his breastplate as if the latter did not exist, then burying itself deep in the man's chest. Even more shocking, that rider suddenly burst into flames, his terrible wound the point of origin. The corpse fell off the frightened horse, colliding with another mount who then shied, throwing his own rider to the ground. Another shaft caught a guard in the leg, but what seemed a bad wound at best became a new terror as that, too, erupted in fire. Screaming, the soldier frantically slapped at a limb entirely engulfed by quickly spreading flames. His animal, too, shied, sending the unfortunate man to the ground. Even there, the flames would not cease, already spreading up and around the victim's waist. Of the 40 or so riders in the patrol, at least a third lay either dead or near to it, all the bodies afire. Several horses also lay stricken. The rest of the soldiers fought for control of their panicked steeds. A smile on his face, Augustus Malevolent turned back to his deadly horde.
"Second and third ranks, advance and attack."
A war cry that would have chilled most men, but only served to thrill the general, erupted from the throats of those summoned. The demonic warriors poured over the dune. As with Malevolent's late soldiers, they kept their ranks tight and orderly. Yet still he could see the savagery in their movements, the inhuman lust in their continual shouts. In numbers, they more than surpassed those of the riders, but not enough that, under normal circumstances, the patrol could not readily fight their way to freedom. One of the officers spotted the marauding band and called out a warning. Immediately, the survivors of the patrol turned toward Lut Gholein. However, Malevolent had no intention of letting them go. Glancing at the archers, he ordered another volley. This time, the shafts flew far over his adversaries, just as intended. Moments later, the sand in front of the retreating patrol exploded with fire as the arrows struck the ground. For a few precious seconds, a wall of flame cut off all hope of escape. Those few precious seconds were all the demons needed to reach their foes. They swarmed around the riders, swords and spears up. Several riders and horses fell quickly, pin-cushioned. The defenders fought back, thrusting at their assailants. One managed to strike what should have been a mortal blow, only to have Malevolent's unholy warrior completely ignore the blade in his side while he pulled the stunned soldier off his mount. An officer from the patrol attempted to organize better resistance. Two of the demons dragged him down. Abandoning their weapons, they tore his armor from his body, then tore into the flesh underneath.
They are enthusiastic,
Zazak remarked with some amusement.
Just so long as they recall what I said this morning. They will do so.
One of the few remaining defenders made a mad break for Lut Gholein. A demon grabbed at his leg and would have brought him down, but another suddenly tore his comrade's clawing fingers from the hapless rider, enabling the human to make good his escape.
You see, this one promised you that they would obey your orders, warlord. Then, as soon as the rest have been dealt with, we'll move forward. You'll remain behind, I trust. For now, warlord.
Zazax had suggested that, without a true human form, he would be too obvious a sight for this first struggle. In daylight, the demon could not apparently create sufficiently the illusion of a man, as he had done that night. In fact, had General Malevolent inspected the shadowed face better during that encounter, he would have seen that no true features had actually existed, just hints of them. The mantis's explanation for his hesitation had a few holes in it that the general would discuss with him further, but he knew that such a conversation could wait. The armor called to Malevolent. All he had to do was take the city to get it. Below, the slaughter of the patrol took but a few short minutes more, the defenders' ranks dwindling with each passing second. More and more, the true nature of Malevolent's force became evident, as the demons fell upon the soldiers, drenching the sand with blood. By this time, the lone survivor had reached the gates of Lut Gholein. Horns blared behind the walls, warning being given to all that the kingdom had been attacked.
All right, let's let them see us.
He raised his hand high in the air, and in it formed the fiery ebony sword that he had used on the scarab demons.
Advance!
The clouds rumbled and lightning flashed as General Malevolent's army came out of hiding. Below, the first and second rank formed up, their lines a little more ragged than before. The feast of bloodletting had stirred up the demons there, making them forget some of the human traits they had stolen. Still, so long as they obeyed his commands to the letter, the general could forgive the slight error. The howling wind whipped Malevolent's cloak around. He adjusted his helmet, bent his head slightly down to avoid the sand blown into the air. As of yet, the sky had not given any indication of rain, but even that would not stop him now. Panic must be spreading among the common folk within. The soldiers, however, would, at this moment, be studying his advancing force and determining that, despite the wholesale slaughter of the patrol, this new foe lacked the numbers to be a true threat to them. They would make one of two choices: either defend the walls only, or send out a much larger force seeking retribution for the horrific deaths of which the one surviving guard would speak. Understanding human emotions, Augustus Malevolent predicted that they would choose the latter.
All ranks into line formation.
The hellish horde spread out, gradually creating two larger, imposing rows. To the commanders in Lut Gholein, it would be clear that the invaders sought to make their force look more impressive. Yet those same commanders would also think how foolish the newcomers had to be to try such an apparent trick. Lut Gholein would also wait to see if a second force followed after the first. They would judge the possibility of that by how near to the walls Malevolent dared lead his troops. The commanders would then decide whether the risk was worth it to crush the first wave, then retreat back inside before any aid might arrive. The demons began to lose some of the order in their ranks, but for the most part they held as they should. Their new warlord had promised them much blood, much mayhem, and that alone kept them in control. They had but one order to obey once the walls of the city had been breached. The man, clad in the crimson armor, had to be brought to Malevolent immediately. All others they could deal with as they desired. As he and his force reached the point midway between the mangled bodies of the unfortunate patrol and the very gates of the fabled realm, a long row of turbaned figures with bows suddenly arose at the battlements. In quick fashion, they loosed a storm of arrows, all arced perfectly to wipe out the first line of attackers, including the general himself. However, as each shaft neared Malevolent, a brief flash of light erupted around every single one, obliterating them before they could touch even his horse. More than a score of arrows vanished in such a way, the archers evidently determined to slay the enemy's leader quickly, if they could. Yet around him, his warriors fell one after another, shafts sticking out of throats, insides, even in heads. One by one, the rain of arrows whittled down the first row, and even many in the second, leaving the would-be warlord with visible losses of nearly half his followers. Lightning played above Lut Gholein, as if marking the next phase of the defenders' intended vengeance. The gates opened, a vast legion of hardened, bitter fighters on both horseback and foot, charging in perfect order toward what remained of the murderous invaders. The turbaned warriors spread out, creating a series of rows, not only longer than Malevolent's, but also several times thicker. As he had surmised, defending from the battlements had not been satisfying to his adversaries. They would make him and his pay for the butchered riders, at the same time garnering some glory for themselves. Fools, he muttered, trying hard to hold back a smile. Impetuous fools. General Malevolent made no move to retreat. In normal combat conditions, that would have proven even more costly than his suicidal advance. At least his men could die knowing that they took more of the enemy with them, or so Lut Gholein's commanders must also be thinking. And as the opposing sides converged, he signaled to one of the few surviving warriors next to him, the one to which had been given the battle horn. The hellish soldier raised the horn to his lips and blew, sending out a mournful cry throughout the field of combat. From the sand arose the supposed dead, General Augustus Malevolent's demons, charging forward, regardless of the wounds the arrows had inflicted. Armored figures with shafts sticking out of their throats or their eyes moved to meet the stunned defenders, some of whom let out horrified cries and tried to back away, only to collide with those advancing behind them. The turbaned line slowed, faltered, as the horrific sight registered with each man in front. In a voice that smothered the thunder, Malevolent roared, "Slay them! Slay them all!" The demons roared and fell upon their more numerous but merely mortal foes. They tore into the humans, with their hellish strength completely severing limbs and even heads from those nearest. The foremost of Lut Gholein's defenders perished horribly. Several split open completely by swords. Others ripped apart by hand while they screamed. Swords and lances had little effect on the general's troops, although occasionally a demon would indeed fall. Yet despite these one or two losses, the balance of the battle clearly had begun to turn. The bodies of the defenders began to pile up as those in back, still somewhat ignorant of the terrible truth, forced their comrades into the unyielding maw of death. A horn within the walls sounded, and suddenly a new rain of arrows fell upon the invaders. Unfortunately, the new volley had little hope of success, and even contributed to the continual slaughter of the defenders on the ground, many of them now falling victim to their own archers. Almost immediately after the first wave of shafts, the horn sounded again, but by that point scores more had perished. Out among the demons, Malevolent fought as possessed as the rest of his infernal legion. The ebony blade cut a bloody swath through his foes, neither armor nor bone slowing it in any fashion. Soon, even his monstrous horde gave him room, the general's viciousness approaching their limits. Malevolent's black armor had been stained from head to foot in crimson, but, if anything, it spurred him on to harsher, more brutal acts. The ground around him abruptly exploded. His horse fell hard, dying instantly. More fortunate, General Malevolent landed a few yards away. The explosion, which would have killed any normal man, did little more than stun him for a few seconds. Rising, he looked up at the walls to see a pair of robed figures, Viserai, no doubt in the service of the young Sultan. Malevolent had expected Lutgolain to throw sorcery at him, but had become so caught up in the massacre that he had forgotten. A fury, such as he had never experienced, took hold of him. He recalled Vizjun, recalled how Horazon and the others had tricked him, led his hellish horde into a trap. Not this time. Augustus Malevolent held up a fist, shouted words he had never known before. Above him, the heavens appeared ready to explode. A fierce wind struck the battlements, but only where the sorcerers stood. Those who watched saw the pair pulled high into the air, where they helplessly flailed about, no doubt trying to cast counterspells. The warlord brought his fist down, hard. With wild shrieks, the two Viserai plummeted to the ground as if shot from great bows. When the sorcerers hit, even the demons backed away, so startled were they by the terrible force with which the pair hit. Only Malevolent watched with great satisfaction, his first step toward avenging his loss at Vizjun now taken. That his memories had so mingled with Bardak's that he could no longer tell them apart did not even occur to him anymore. There could be only one warlord of blood, and he stood nearly at the gates of this trembling city. His quick eyes caught sight of one among the failing defenders, an officer of high rank. A demon stood before the bearded warrior, the black-clad creature forcing the enemy commander to his knees. General Malevolent acted swiftly, summoning the magical sword and driving it through the back of the stunned demon. The monstrous warrior shrieked, and the body within the black armor shriveled until nothing remained but a thin, papery layer of dried flesh over bone. A wisp of green smoke rose from the collapsing corpse, smoke that dissipated in the wind. Stepping over the pile of bones and metal, Malevolent headed for the officer he had just saved. The general had known that the demon would not have paused in time, and the loss of one of his minions meant little to him. After Lutgolain, he would be able to summon every beast in hell. The weakened officer tried to fight him, but with a gesture of his hand, Malevolent sent the man's own weapon flying into the throat of one of the other defenders. He seized the hapless officer by the throat, dragging him up to a standing position.
Hear me, and you may live, fool. You might as well slay me now.
Tightening his grip, Malevolent held on until the fighter nearly suffocated. At the last, he loosened his fingers slightly, allowing the man to breathe again.
Your life, the life of everyone in Lutgolain, is mine. Only one thing will save you for the time being. One thing.
What? His prisoner gasped, now much more sensible.
There is a stranger in the city, a man dressed in armor, the color of the blood that covers both of us, and that you might yet keep running through your veins. Bring him to me. Bring him out through the gates and send him to me.
He could see the commander calculating the advantages and disadvantages.
You'll put an end to this battle? I'll put an end to it when I have what I want. And until I see him, Lute Gulain will know no peace. Think well on this, for you can already see that your walls will be of little good against me.
It did not take the man long.
I will do it. Then go.
General Malevolent contemptuously threw the officer back, waving away a pair of demonic soldiers ready to strike the man down. To the enemy commander, he added,
Call a retreat. Any who pass through the gates will not be slaughtered. Any who fail to follow quick enough will serve as fine food for the carrion crows. This is all I grant you. Be grateful you get this much.
The officer fled from him, stumbling in the direction of Lute Gulain. Malevolent watched him signal to someone up on the walls. A few moments later, a pitiful wail went up from one of the war horns in the city. An armored figure with eyes that matched the blood on Augustus Malevolent's armor came up to him. The face had once belonged to Zacco.
Let them go, warlord? Of course not. Beat them to the ground. Let none survive who do not make it to the gates. Any who do, though, you do not touch, and none of you are to enter the city.
He glanced in the direction of the enemy commander, who had not bothered much to wait for his men.
And to make sure that he survives, he'll have much to tell them.
Yes, warlord. The Zacco demon bowed once, then hesitated. Not to enter the city? We leave Lute Gulain alone?
I want the armor. We will harass them, even do what we can to damage their defenses. But until I have the armor, and to the head of the one who dared keep it from me, the city will not be touched.
General Malevolent, Warlord Malevolent, smiled grimly.
I promised them an end to the battle, that Lute Gulain would not know peace until I had the armor. Once I have it, I will give to them exactly what I promised, a final end to the battle, and the peace of the grave.